You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian. Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to another episode here on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. We've got episode number 67 coming to you this week, and our special guest is none other than A&R extraordinaire himself, Mr. Michael Alago. Most of you are familiar with Michael from his 2016 documentary titled Who the Fuck Is That Guy? The Fabulous Journey of Michael Alago. And of course, Michael is most famously known for signing Metallica to Elektra Records back in the early 80s. And of course, he signed several other great metal bands in the 80s, including FLOTSAM and JETSAM, Metal Church, and of course, in the 90s, when he was at Geffen Records, he was responsible for signing the Great White Zombie as well. And, Mike came on the podcast to talk about his new book titled I Am Michael Alago, Breathing Music, Signing Metallica, Beating Death. A really awesome read. No doubt you guys are going to love. Definitely pick that up if you get a chance. It's on Amazon and, of course, all the online retail outlets. And, so no doubt you guys are going to definitely enjoy this podcast. And, of course, check out all of our social media pages for new episodes and updates on the podcast, as well as updates on the new Inside Metal documentary titled Bay Area Godfathers. Details are still being hashed out in terms of the release date. And, of course, once it is, we'll let you know ASAP. And I'll just say it's well worth the wait, and you guys will most certainly enjoy what the Armenian maven of metal himself, Bob Nalbandian, has in store for you on his next documentary. So, without further ado, here we go. Episode number 67 featuring A&R rep, Mr. Michael Alago. All right, well, Shockwave Skull Sessions, episode number 67. And today we've got a very special guest with us, an A&R legend in the metal world. Most of you know him from his new book called I Am Michael Alago, Breathing Music, Signing Metallica, Beating Death. The man himself, Mr. Michael Alago. How's it going, Michael?
Oh, pretty good. Thank you for having me. But I think a lot of your listeners probably know me before the book from a documentary. Am I allowed to say the F word?
You sure? You can curse all you want.
Oh, good. Most people know about me because of my documentary, Who the Fuck Is That Guy?
Yes.
The Fabulous Journey of Michael Alago, which is on Netflix and on Amazon Prime. You know, for all my years, my 25 years as an A&R executive, I was like behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So only in this last 3 years, everybody has seen my mug everywhere. Uh-huh. And you know what? It's all good. Here we are together.
Here we are. Yes. And I did, and I do know the movie. I watched it. It's a great movie. We'll definitely talk about that as well as we go forward with this. Absolutely. So let's just start here. You know, I did read the book. I thought it was fantastic. And, you know, the first thing I noticed when I read it in terms of heavy metal is I really believe you were destined for a life working in it, mainly just because of the fact that when you were a kid, you walked around Brooklyn and you happened to see those proto-metal kings called Sir Lord Baltimore, who are kind of arguably known as one of the first heavy metal bands to ever exist. So the fact that you were a kid seeing that almost was like an omen that you were destined to work in this genre. Tell us a bit about that, seeing those guys back in the day when you were a little kid. I think you said...
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I lived in Borough Park in Brooklyn, and I went to the Catholic school, St. Francis de Chantal. Mm-hmm. I must have been about 12 or 13 years old. There was walking home, there was a corner where there was a storefront. The storefront was hidden by sheets that were hung up everywhere. Mm-hmm. But I heard music coming out of there, and it was very heavy. And even at 13, it pricked up my ears, and I was like, whoa, what's this? Mm-hmm. So I peeked inside, and I saw these three long hairs, and they were doing some heavy playing, very Zeppelin-esque. You know, it's fun. Malcolm Dome, formerly, or maybe still, of Kerrang! Magazine, I believe Malcolm Dome was the person who coined the phrase heavy metal. Mm-hmm. We could check that out, but I could swear I've heard that from so many people. They were heavy metal before a lot of us even perhaps knew the phrase. Mm-hmm. And so I just loved hearing that music. I remember knocking on the door one day, and they were like, what do you want? Mm-hmm. And I just said I loved the music. So sometimes they left the door open, but the neighbors complained. And once or twice I got to go inside and just sit there like a 12-year-old and just listen to this heavy music. And, heavy music has always been my life. I've always just loved that style of music. The heavier, the better, I always say.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right on. Hey, Michael, it's Bob Nalbandian.
Hi.
Of course, we go way back since 1990 or so. And I want to even go back further. I actually haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I did see the movie, wonderful movie. And, I'm very curious about you growing up. And I guess we're kind of similar age. I'm 55 now, and I was going to clubs when I was 16 years old. I think I saw my first concert. I was about 15 when I saw AC/DC with Bon Scott. And back then, it was a whole different thing because you don't see young kids now. There were no age limits at a lot of the clubs. And I'm wondering if that was the same in New York for you to go to a lot of these.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my first concert ever was June 3rd, 1973. It was Alice Cooper at Madison Square Garden. It was the last night of the $1 Billion Babies tour. That started all the insanity for me. In New York City, back then, it was in the 80s, it was a very different New York than it is right now.
Sure.
Even though there was a lot of 18 and over bars, clubs that you had to be that age to go to, I found being a 15, 16-year-old, looking like I was definitely 15 years old, I never got carded. It was just like a thing. People were not strict like they are now. So back then, you saw your friends at all these places. You got to meet, if Debbie Harry was at the bar at Max's Kansas City and Blondie were up and coming, you got to meet her. You were at CBGB and, there was Joey Ramone. It was just a different New York. It was a great New York, and I'm glad that I knew enough to be curious enough to go out there and see and hear all that stuff.
Well, those were great times, being able to be that young and go to see live music. That's what we lived for. I mean, we didn't have video games. We didn't have videos. We didn't have anything.
None of that.
Going out at that age, and it seems, and I had pretty strict parents. I mean, I had a curfew. I had to be home by midnight by a lot of these things, so I had to cut the club show short or whatever until I was 18 or whatever, and I had my own car. But that was what we did. And one thing I'm curious about, because I know you worked with the Dead Boys very early on. You ran their fan club, and who are known more or less as one of the original New York punk bands. Was it because in LA growing up and knowing the scene when I was a teenager, I had a lot of friends that were punk and metal, and it was kind of either or. And I had friends of kind of both, but, you didn't go to punk shows. There was a club called the Cuckoo's Nest. I grew up in Huntington Beach in Orange County, and that was like the punk place. But there were other clubs when punk started, like the Starwood and the Whiskey and places like that. And when they started, they would have bands like the Weirdos and Van Halen play together. Or AC/DC and this kind of crossover punk metal band, the Weasels, would do shows. They would kind of intermix. And I know you did a lot of booking in the beginning at the Ritz. Was it a separate thing because I know, of course, the punk place over there was CBGB's. But with
CBGB and Max's Kansas City, there was a lot of punk music being performed there.
Oh, okay. Was there a lot of crossover with punk and rock metal bands playing together?
Well, I think early on, if bands were playing what we call punk, that's what they were playing. Later on, I think some of those artists kind of crossed over, like the Cro-Mags. At one point, they were pure punk. At some point, the music crossed over into metal.
Well, was it a separate thing? Because in LA, it was kind of separate when punk and metal started. Then it did kind of cross over with Suicidal and some of the West Coast bands. Was it kind of the same in the beginning before you had the Cro-Mags and the Bad Brains and all that kind of crossing over? Was it a very separate thing, punk and metal?
styles of music were separate, and I don't know if metal bands and punk bands played on the same night together. But, we were out as young people. There was some place to go every single night in New York, and we went out.
Well, let's go. Let's talk about when your first foray into working for a record label at Elektra as an A&R. The first band you signed was a band called Shrapnel, which I didn't realize it until recently. Until I was really reading the book and I looked it up. That actually in those bands featured Dave and Phil, who were from Monster Magnet. I had no idea that they were in that band, as well as Daniel Ray, the producer. So
That's right.
A lot of guys in that band. Although I know in your book you talked about how obviously that was it didn't do as well as you'd like to have done, and to you considered it a big, a kind of a big failure. What was that initial feeling when you first signed your first band? It doesn't make it. Like I said, as you stated. Did it affect your confidence at all when you're signing bands going forward from there? I mean, obviously, whatever you did, it worked out great. But did you feel a little like, oh man, I don't know if I can do this? And what did you learn from that initial experience with that?
Sure.
With that signing?
Well, actually, I started in the music business in 1980. My first job was from 1980 to 83 at a nightclub in the East Village called the Ritz. I learned to become the booking director there. After that, I got an executive job at Elektra Records in 1983. I interviewed with the chairman, Bob Krasnow. He hired me. The problem was I had no idea what A&R meant. I asked friends of mine in the music business. They laughed in my face. And I then very quickly learned that A&R means artist and repertoire. The A&R department is the most important department at a record company. If you do not have great records and great artists, you're doomed, and you probably get fired. Going to your question about Shrapnel. Shrapnel were a band from Red Bank, New Jersey, like a post-punk band, pop band, and my friends were in that band. They were really cool. I made an EP with them. That part of the EP was produced by Vince Ely, the drummer for the Psychedelic Furs, and the other part of the record was produced by Richie Cordell, who worked with Joan Jett, who worked with Tommy James and the Shondells. It did okay at college radio. The powers that be were not in love with Shrapnel at the label, so I had to release them. What I learned from that is you don't sign your friends. That's what I learned from that. After that, no, I did not lose my confidence. I was grateful and excited that, as a youngster, maybe 21-ish, I had a job in the music business. And I said my whole life, I want to work in music. I didn't know what that meant as a 14, 15-year-old, but music was my whole life. I had no plan B, and I'm grateful that my life went in the direction that it went musically. And, so right after that, Shrapnel, I then signed Metallica in summer of 1984.
Yeah, well, obviously you did a great rebound off of the Shrapnel, thing. I mean, signing Metallica, obviously it speaks for itself. Nothing really to be said there. The part about Metallica that interested me reading the book was that, you initially said that it was initially with Johnny Z from Megaforce came to you, and he really wanted to push Raven. Those were his guys. But you were kind of like you liked Raven, but as you mentioned in the book that you liked them, but they weren't necessarily really what Elektra, I guess, was looking for. Whereas Metallica, obviously, you were blown away, and that was your main thing. You wanted to sign them, but you also said that when you talked to Johnny, he was really pissed off that you were showing interest in Metallica and not Raven. I mean, why do you think that would be? Just because you'd figure, I mean, just having a major label being interested in any. I guess, band on your roster, you'd be excited. But as you said, he was not really too happy that you were showing interest in Metallica.
Well, we became colleagues very early on. He had this independent label that is wonderful called Megaforce. They really didn't have the kind of finances that a place like Elektra Records, which is part of Time Warner, had. He gave me a lot of his vinyl. I listened to it. He wanted me to sign Raven. I gave them money to do demos. They gave me back a fantastic demo of 5 songs. The problem was I had already seen Metallica twice live. I had heard Kill 'Em All. And as we all know, if we love metal, that is a record that blew everybody away. It was a record that didn't sound like anything else whatsoever. At that point in time, they were creating a buzz with the Metal Underground, their demo tape. They were the talk back then because they were so extraordinary live. You know, Metallica were never not great live, even at that in the early stages of their career. They are wildly charismatic on stage. James is a fucking ringleader. He knew how to whip the crowd into a frenzy, and that's what I loved about them, that they took the bull by the friggin' horns, and they just killed it every night.
No, definitely.
All right. You know, going back again to the booking stuff you did, because you talked about confidence, I'm sure the fact that you booked some of the bands that became huge monsters, much like Metallica, U2 and Madonna, and you know, Bow Wow Wow, Susie and the Banshees, even James Brown, very early on, you know, before Metallica and U2 broke. I actually saw U2 on that first show at a small club at the Woodstock, believe it or not, playing in front of a handful of people.
That must have been 1981.
Yep, it was when I Will Follow was just starting to break on
That's
MTV.
Right. That's when that album came out. It was people started knowing about them early on because the import version of that album came out, and a lot of us were back in the day were into going to our favorite record stores and buying like, wow, what are the imports from England this week? And that whatever that week was, we all bought Boy. And then sometimes we check to see if the same songs were on the domestic version, or there extra songs on the vinyl. If there was a Japanese version, you were always sure that there's definitely an extra song or two on there. But yeah, they came here in in 1981, and I booked their first show at the Ritz. It was extraordinary.
Wow.
I mean, very exciting as a young band to feel that energy, and then we all know they became superstars.
Absolutely. So, I mean, again, I mean, as a confidence booster, the fact that you, in a way, booking is kind of like A&R. You kind of discovered this band, you liked them, you booked them at your club, and boom, they took off.
Well, yeah, you know, the Ritz is, as we all know now, is Webster Hall.
Sure.
It probably seats or stands about 1,500 or so people. Knowing that club existed back then, all the booking agents would call my boss, Jerry Brandt. A lot of times Jerry handed a lot of the bookings over to me. And so we were aware of what was in the Billboard Top 100. We were aware of whose albums were hot. So we knew at one point when Tina Turner was making a comeback, we had her there for 5 nights, sold out every night. At the early days, Prince put his first album out on Warner Brothers. We had him there for 2 nights, sold out. It was a wide variety of music that I got to experience by booking certain artists at the Ritz. I was like a sponge. It was an incredible learning experience for me. And yes, like A&R, I was booking the great artists of the day who were selling records. And then once I got into my A&R job and I finally knew what the heck A&R meant, I was signing things that I felt were great. Every day I would get boxes of cassettes and vinyl of artists looking for a major label deal. A lot of things were rotten. A lot of things were good. And rarely was there anything in there that was great. Now, I heard a lot of good music, but you can't sign good. You would overwhelm yourself. You would overwhelm the company. So I met a lot with publishers, lawyers, managers, and sometimes artists themselves. And that's how I wound up finding bands.
Just going back really quick to Metallica, you know, in the book you said that when you wanted to sign them, obviously you mentioned that it was a big no-no in the industry to really mess with anyone who's already signed to a contract.
Well, it's a little bit illegal too.
Yeah,
and one could get in trouble for that. But go ahead.
Yeah, no. In terms of like, I could see that definitely with a major league. But you know, being that Metallica was just on in India on Megaforce, you know, and being that, you know, obviously I'm assuming, they were probably looking for like a P&D deal, like most of the labels did back then. And you did say it could affect the parent company at the time, Time Warner. I'm just curious as to how it could, especially if it's just an independent, label. I mean, would it be a lot easier, I think, to kind of get someone out of that contract being from an independent label, obviously, than being from a major, which is, I could see that being definitely a big no-no.
Well, you know what? I could get into trouble for screwing around with someone else's contract.
Okay.
And whether you're an independent label or not,
doesn't matter.
When somebody has a contract with a band and you're wooing these people, you could get into trouble. But you know what? Johnny and I had a relationship. He was not happy that I didn't want to sign Raven, but instead Metallica. And like I say in all my interviews, money talks.
Sure.
So there was a financial deal that was satisfactory to Time Warner, and in that deal, it was much satisfied for Johnny Z. He walked away with a great deal in perpetuity. It made everybody happy. That signing changed the face of heavy metal and rock and roll. After that, everybody wanted their own version of Metallica. That doesn't happen, and it just changed history. And like I said, everybody walked away happy.
Sure. I'm going to move on to Metal Church, the great band that you signed. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Which is kind of funny because they went by the name Shrapnel for a while, correct? I mean, I've been reading about that, which is pretty funny since that was a band you signed. Your first signing was Shrapnel, right?
I think I remember that, but that's vague. But yeah.
Okay.
So what's the question?
Well, so the question I was going to ask is basically, although those guys had a really have had a great career. I mean, they sold 70,000 independent records right before you guys did sign them. Why do you think that maybe they never got to that big four status? Because I think they had the songs, they had the talent, obviously, but they never got to that tippy top. I mean, they've had, like I said, great career, but why do you think they didn't really get to that biggest status, that biggest four?
People have asked me that question before, and I'm happy to answer it. Not everyone gets there.
Sure.
Sometimes there's a cap on people's careers. So if you're dedicated to your craft, like Kurt Vanderhoof has been, you just keep working. You're a working band that tours every year. Kurt is always he's like a scientist in his recording studio, and he writes all the material, and you get what you get with Metal Church, and that's always a great, solid record. But it's kind of unexplainable, really. It's an ethereal thing about why certain people make it huge and others don't. It's just the way it is.
Sure.
Not everybody gets to that gazillion status or becomes the biggest stadium band. So at some point, you got to be happy with playing a couple of 1,000-seaters, and that's what you do with the rest of your life. And everybody winds up being happy.
Michael,
it's just like I said, not everyone gets that massive success.
Yeah.
And who knows why?
I was going to say, at Elektra, you were kind of known as within all the labels and within the fans, you were known as the metal A&R guy. Of course, you signed Metallica, then Metal Church, Flotsam and Jetsam. When there weren't very many labels at that time still that weren't signing metal bands. It was mostly an independent thing. Or they would start with an independent and go to a major. But with leaving Elektra and going to Geffen, I know that's always a very hard thing. And of course, with someone like you who are so close with a band, it's almost like, leaving a football team and going to another team. It's you're a trader. Was that a tough decision for you going to
Yes, it was a bit of a tough decision leaving Elektra for the first time. It all came down to money. I wanted more money. They were not giving me the money that I felt like I've earned. Geffen heard about me being this out there, successful A&R person. They gave me the money I wanted. So when I got to Geffen, I worked in this satellite office in New York, even though they were based on Sunset Boulevard in a ton of bungalows in West Hollywood. Yep. It was different. Working, I don't ever recommend, if you're working at any kind of corporation, that you work in this satellite office. You know, you need to be in people's faces. And at some point, you know, I signed Kane Roberts from Alice Cooper's band, and I signed White Zombie. That's a long story in itself, but if I'm going to talk about my career in 30 seconds, I was at Elektra, I was at Geffen, I was at Elektra, and I was at Geffen. That's 20 years right there. Wow. So now you could ask me something else.
Well, go to White Zombie. I mean, you obviously White Zombie became huge, multi-selling band,
Huge.
and you know, that was one of your very first signings. And I guess being out of New York, that was kind of to your advantage, being a New York band, a New York club band at the time, White Zombie, who again were independent on, I believe, through Caroline, was it?
That's right. They were on Caroline for a bunch of EPs and full lengths. Yep.
So the fact that they had you at that satellite office was obviously a great thing that you might not have discovered White Zombie if they brought you over there.
Well, I don't know if it was a great thing. It was what it was. They were a New York band. I was a New York A&R person. My friend Daniel Ray, who was a producer, he's worked with Ronnie Spector, the Ramones. He was in Shrapnel. He turned me on to White Zombie. He was soliciting 3 New York bands: Raging Slab, Circus of Power, and White Zombie. Nobody wanted White Zombie. He got Raging and Circus signed to RCA Records. I got to see White Zombie at some little dinky hole in the wall. There was something about them that I absolutely loved. I didn't know if they had any real material. It didn't bother me. I just noticed, again, these were young people who were so charismatic on stage that I thought, I'm going to take a chance on these people. And they were the loveliest people that I've ever worked with. So I wound up signing them. And, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of White Zombie, I think a lot of people don't realize, you know, their earlier stuff, all those that Caroline stuff was so different than the Los Exorcisto, you know, stuff. I mean, they were more of a noise rock band. They would play with, like, you know, Sonic Youth and, you know, that kind of crowd.
Rat R, Sonic Youth, yes. That's what they started out like.
Yeah.
But then, you know, they did want to make a change. I needed and wanted them to make a change. So when they were starting to give me demos and stuff, they were leaning more towards that metal angle, and I was thrilled. So we loved the way Andy Wallace produced Slayer. So that's who I had produce them, and it just by default, by having Andy Wallace there in the recording studio, everything leaned towards that metal angle. Okay. And that is the White Zombie that Geffen Records presented with Los Exorcisto Devil Music Volume 1.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I know you stated also that it took you, when you went to Geffen, it took you 9 months to sign your first band. And I'm just curious, and I know it's probably different in each label, you know, especially at the majors, but, you know, when it comes to being an A&R and you're working at a major label, how does it work in terms of, like, the time frame where to sign a band? I mean, is it one of those things where, you know, you get to sign one quickly, or do you wait? Do you switch it up with signing a newer one, then a veteran? How does that kind of work? Or do you have your own formula like you had that everyone has their own?
Well, it's a strange answer because I don't know if I had waited or I signed White Zombie, 9 months in. You know, I think when an A&R person is at a label, the head of the label has faith in you that you are going to sign something that's going to be a bestseller. So, you know, you either sink or you swim. I decided I was going to swim. And there was no time frame of you better sign 2 things a year or one. You know, it's just, it is what it is. It happens when it happens. But, you know, Lord knows that you can't be signing stuff that doesn't sell, because that's when the people who in business affairs who handle the bottom line say, you know, they report you to the head of the company and they're like, you know, Alago is signing all this stuff and it's not selling. That, thank God, never happened with me, but that's what happens with A&R people. You sign stuff, and you sign enough stuff, and it doesn't sell, you're out of a job. Sure. So it's about you sink or you swim, you sign great things, and you hope that they're going to sell. So there's not really a deadline of, I could sign stuff every month or every 6 months. I was very specific about my signings. And in my whole career, I didn't wind up signing a lot of things anyway, but it doesn't matter. I did what I did, and thank God I was wildly successful at that.
Sure.
Michael, talk a little bit about, because a lot of people don't know, after, of course, the mid-'90s got a little bit, there was a lot of change in the music industry, and you left Geffen and you were working for Palm Pictures, which was kind of an interesting label, I believe. Was that through Island Records?
Okay. Yeah. So Elektra Geffen.
Right.
Palm Pictures. Palm Pictures is run by Chris Blackwell.
Right.
Chris Blackwell was a very well-renowned, historic, legendary character in the music business from the 60s. He owned Island Records. He signed everyone from Bob Marley to U2 to, he was one. Island Records was a very well-respected label forever. At that point in time, for I don't know the reason, he sold Island and he started a new label called Palm Pictures. Palm Pictures was an independent company that was half record company and half film company. It was cool. It was fun to be there. I only stayed there for 3 years. I worked on the first Chris Jericho record, Fozzy. I worked with Local H, and I worked with Speed Dealer from Dallas. Those are the 3 records I worked on there. And then after that, around 2004, after 24 or so years of doing A&R, I just decided to quit the job. I was not feeling good again. I didn't want that pressure, and I thought I did what I did, and I was great at it. In the 2000s, you were seeing that people, the internet was with us now, and you were seeing that people weren't buying records like they used to. They would file share, they would download. Basically, they would steal. That wasn't really cool with me, so that's why I decided to officially leave the business then. After that, I worked on a lot of stuff independently.
Yeah, well, one of the things you have signed, and if you look at the bands that you have worked with over the years, is you definitely gave a lot of like second, third chances to a lot of artists who would be considered at the time washed up, or they were just kind of they were done. I mean,
sure.
You look at bands like, obviously the Misfits you worked with. I know you almost came close to signing Lynyrd Skynyrd back with their rebirth in the early 90s. And, of course, outside of the metal world, you also worked with Nina Simone and Cyndi Lauper, especially Cyndi Lauper doing a blues record, so it was completely different than her past stuff. Was it, as an A&R guy, was it tough to refrain from, say, jumping the gun on signing, like, bands or artists that you loved growing up? Was it hard to, like, kind of put away that fanboy and be like, no, I can't. I got to be like smart about this, because it's got to be difficult when you're working with these bands that you idolized growing up, and here it is, you have the opportunity to sign them. Even though they might be past their prime, it's you've got to obviously weigh the pros and cons. How difficult is that to sort of like check yourself in terms of?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, my ears always approached things from a fan's point of view. But as an executive, I knew I had to make executive decisions. I knew that, I don't know how to answer this. I kind of was very specific about knowing what I should sign and what I shouldn't sign. The only reason, we could use Lynyrd Skynyrd as a perfect example of that. They were huge already. This was after the fact of the accident. Bill Graham, major San Francisco concert promoter, another legendary figure, managed them. I talk about it in my book, I Am Michael Alago. I went to I went to Jacksonville. I went to some mall that was empty. They had a little room that they rehearsed in. I was walking with Bill Graham. He wouldn't tell me who they were. And when I heard them, you knew you were hearing either the Allman Brothers or Skynyrd, because they both have that sound. So, I was thrilled. I felt like a 14-year-old fan again. I had big dinner with them that night. But in leaving, I thought to myself, love these people. But this would not serve me or Geffen Records. Keep in mind, Geffen was as hip as Elektra. They didn't sign everything, as they used to say back in the day, anything that stuck to the wall. They were very specific. They were signing things, well, when David started the label, Elton John, Donna Summer, John Lennon. Then we all the A&R people came in. I signed White Zombie. Somebody signed Beck. Somebody signed Whitesnake. Somebody signed Nirvana, Guns N' Roses. So at that point in time, in the 2000s, Skynyrd wouldn't have just worked musically there. So I was thrilled that I had the experience, but professionally, I had to say no.
Sure. You know, I know, just to talk a little about, you know, your personal thing that you talk about a lot, both in the book and the movie, is obviously, you know, I think the question or the you know, thing you hear a lot about, obviously, is you're a very, you know, proud gay man who grew up in this metal world. Which must have been so difficult, or just so, I mean, in a way, it sounded like from what I'm reading, it really wasn't very difficult for you because you were just so very open for it. You know, you even talked about how you were never, you know, in a closet. You've always been very open about it. And I'm sure that obviously made it a lot easier, a little bit easier, I should say, to deal with, you know, being the, you know, one of the very, I'm sure, a few people, at least that were open.
Well, you know, I was a person from the get-go who was always honest about everything. My mom instilled in me that you are who you are. People are going to like you or not. And with that thought, I always just thought to myself, hey, man, you're either going to like me or you're not going to like me. And if it all had to do, if we're just talking about things that are music-related, there was nothing sexual to talk about then. People knew I was gay. We talked about the friggin' music, and we either liked each other or we didn't. And I never cared if people didn't like me or not. And you know what? Thank God, I think by being open and out and people appreciated that. And I think people, or young men or women who were in the closet, thought, well, you know what, if Michael can be that open, I could be that open too. So I think you teach people something when you might be the outcast or that gay person when there's nobody else around that's gay. You know, you teach people to accept people for who they are, and you either like somebody or you don't. That's like with anything in life.
Sure.
You either like somebody or you don't like the person, no matter what their sexuality is. So I just, like I said, I never had a problem with that, and I continue to just be who I am, and if you don't like me, fuck off. And if you like me, then there's probably lots of stuff that we all have to say to each other.
Yeah, that's great.
About life, about music, about art, about theater, about museums, about addiction, about recovery, whatever. I'm here to be of service to people that I love.
That's awesome.
Well, speaking about addiction and recovery, of course, you're a recovering alcoholic, as are so many people in the music business, not only musicians, but particularly being an A&R person or in the publicity department, you're kind of mixed in with a rock and roll lifestyle. You hang out with the bands, you know, and it's kind of almost pushed on you to, you know, to especially back in the 80s, of course, to party.
Listen, the 80s, all the music, not all, but many music executives, no matter what the department was, everybody was doing cocaine. Everybody was drinking. It was, you know what? It was just a sign of the times. It was the way things were. And, you know, you enjoy yourself until it turns on you.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, do you think, looking back on you know, when you did have the addiction problems, do you think any of that affected, say, any decisions you made as an A&R person at all?
You know, I was good at my job. I was a functioning alcoholic. I probably made some decisions that were not good, personally and professionally. But thank God, never lost my job. Almost lost my mind a few times. And at one point in time, I just thought, I'm sick and tired of this behavior. Alcohol and coke and any kind of drug was not serving me anymore. I did not want to be a no-show. I wanted to be a responsible person who showed up. So when you're sick, when any alcoholic and drug addict is sick and tired of themselves, what do? You ask for help. Like anything in life, you ask for help. And you know what? If you're serious about the shit, you get the help that you need. I asked for help. I knew there were programs for alcoholism and drug addiction. I went to AA, and I've been clean and sober, coming up on 13 years now.
Well, congrats.
And in my sobriety, people know that they can rely on me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to be a no-show. If I say I'm going to do something, I do it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's a great feeling not to rely on drink and drugs. It's a great feeling to not have coke and crack and alcohol hangovers.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great feeling that I take care of my mind, my body, my soul, my spirit. And I just, you know, I'm a happy guy.
Well, congratulations, Michael. That is so awesome.
Thank you so much.
And of course, now your career still blossoms. You're a prominent photographer in New York. You've got a movie out and a book out. And did you see your career lasting this long and continuing to go on?
No, I thought I was going to be dead when I was 30. I had full-blown AIDS when I was 30 years old. There was no medication. I had an incredible doctor who was in the front lines, was in the laboratories, and she took extraordinary care of me. Finally, when there was medication, I took it. I never got sick like that again. Fast forward another 30 years, I'm 60 years old. The virus is at 0 level in my body.
That's great.
I thought I was going to be dead back then, but I wasn't. But what was your question? See, this is why I don't drink anymore.
Well, I think you just answered
you
it
a million fucking times. What's your question? What was the question? Come on.
Actually, you just answered it. It's, about having your career. Did you realize it would last this long?
Wait a minute. Because now I'm on a roll. No, I didn't know what the trajectory of my career was. I thank God I lived from all this insanity, and 30 years later, the only reason I think that movie happened and the book happened was because Drew Stone, my fearless director, followed my career, and he saw this guy has changed his life. Now, who wants to make a movie about a drunk? It's no fun. But the story, my sex, drugs, and rock and roll story has a happy ending. So why not share that with people? And as you can see in the documentary, Who the Fuck Is That Guy? The Fabulous Journey of Michael Alago, because I got to say all that. I always had great relationships with my artists, even when I left them, whether it's John Lydon from Public Image Limited and the Sex Pistols, Metallica, Kurt Vanderhoof from Metal Church, my working on 2 albums with Cyndi Lauper. I never left anywhere in a negative fashion. When I left companies, it was because of money. I think artists understood that. I always did good by my artists. I always stood up for the artists, which got me into trouble at record companies, and I didn't care. So it's wonderful that in sobriety, because I'm a stand-up, show-up kind of guy, Drew made this film. This little book company, Backbeat Books, saw how successful the documentary is. They asked me if I wanted to make a book. I said yes. I had more stories to tell, and I was able to tell a lot of these stories a little more in depth than the movie. So you know what? Listen, I'm grateful every single day that I wake up and I have something to do.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic story, Michael. I recommend anyone out there check out the movie. Who the Fuck Is This Guy? The Fabulous Life of Michael Alago.
Yeah. Well, it's Who the Fuck Is That Guy?
Who the fuck is
you
that
put
guy?
This, you won't find it. The Fabulous Journey of Michael Alago.
Journey of Michael
Netflix,
Alago.
Amazon Prime.
There you go. And of course, the book, I Am Michael Alago, Breathing Music, Signing Metallica, Beating Death. Do you plan to do an audio book? I mean, you've got such a great speaking voice.
So many people ask me, they say, I love hearing your stories. Can you tell me another story? Is your book going to be audio? I hope so. But the book publishing company that I'm with, unfortunately, are still on furlough. A lot of these, they're just getting a lot of offices, as we all know, are just opening up, like right now.
Yeah.
So I haven't had the opportunity to speak with them about an audiobook. The book came out almost 3 months ago, March 25th. I would love to make an audiobook. All I can tell you is I'm going to cross my fingers and hope they say yes.
Totally. And one thing quickly before we go here, there's two things I took away, from the book, Michael, that I believe was really critical to your success. First thing is you never accepted no for an answer. And in fact, I noticed every time someone did say no, you sort of just, it's like it almost drove you flipped the script. And it was more of a positive thing. You never got angry. You never got like me, some of the stuff I read in there, I'm like, but I would have told this person to go fuck themselves. Where you're just like, no, calm and just don't take no for an answer and keep pushing. Second thing was you're a very matter-of-fact individual. And, you hear a lot of people that talked about they never felt like you bullshitted anybody. You were always very honest and trustworthy. And I think those are two, really critical keys to your success over the years. And,
thank you.
It's a great story, obviously your life. And it was great reading the book and seeing the movie. And, we appreciate you coming on and, talking to us about everything today.
Absolutely. And the fact, like you say, that you've retained these relationships with these people over 40 years really says something, especially for someone in the music business. As we all know,
it says that maybe we're all crazy and that we love each other. And like I said, I think when you tell the truth, people appreciate that. So, it's like I'm a no-nonsense kind of guy. And even if an artist maybe perhaps doesn't want to hear the truth, but they know that I have respect for them, they think about it. And they say, Michael, I think you were right about that. And that's not like tooting my horn or anything. I just, I've always been an honest person. And I tell the truth. And when you do that, there are no questions, You're just who you are. And I'm here, like I say, to be of service to artists and friends and people out there, whether it's about giving it, not advice, but when people ask me about addiction and recovery, I just let them know this is what works for me. I hope it works for you.
Well, you're telling the truth must have had to do something with your Catholic school upbringing, huh?
There you go.
Right? Well, great, man. Well, hey, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on.
It was a pleasure, Michael. And, always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate coming on today.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.